Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
I'm very, very pleased to be here. My name is Doug Macdonald. Thank you, Inger, and thank you very much to the organizers of this event for including me here. I should just spend 15 seconds and explain why I was so interested in accepting this invitation. It was a few years ago that I was writing a work on Canadian federal provincial climate policy, and I was wrestling with this question of, given this difference of cost, which Professor Harrison showed in her slides, particularly with Alberta and Saskatchewan, very high per capita emissions and therefore very high reduction costs, inevitably this difficulty for Canada, and I was wrestling with this question of how can we reach agreement on distribution of cost and benefit. And I was off at an author's meeting, and James Meadowcroft said, well, Doug, you should look at the EU burden sharing agreement. And so I did, and I then launched into a research project, and I did an effort to look at how Canada could learn from, it also included Germany, but Germany is a very hierarchical federal system. The EU, a system of sovereign member states, very, very similar to Canada, with a bunch of sovereign, essentially sovereign provinces. So I was very pleased to be here. I was given a mandate by the conference organizers to look at this question of leadership points within a federal system, the opposite of veto points, and then to try and take that back to Ontario. So the talk that I'm going to give here in the 15 minutes or so that I've got are first this question of what decides whether a subnational state plays a lead or a veto role. And then I want to lay out the argument which I present, which comes from that study that I did, that we need to find a way to reach agreement on distribution of cost and benefit. And this gets us back into the discussion we were having with Matt and James and the earlier panel of the extent to which we have distribution top-down versus horizontal or bottom-up. I should explain also that my subject that I'm addressing here is formal coordination. So this is above and beyond. We were talking about policy diffusion, policy learning. Nick was asking, do we have empirical evidence that this actually happens? What I'm looking at above and beyond that is efforts in a system like the EU or Canada to reach agreement on distribution of cost and benefit. Then I'm going to take it back into Ontario, just a minute or two on the basic role of Ontario within Confederation, and then more time on the history of Ontario in terms of national climate change policy. And then answer this question, is it likely that Ontario will play a lead role, and how should we go forward? And to give you the preview of what I'm going to be arguing here, I'm going to be arguing that essentially it is very, very difficult for Ontario to play a lead role simply because it is a province, that it does not have the ability to influence other provinces which a federal government has. And that I'm going to suggest that if you're looking for leadership points, you need to look to the Canadian federal government, and therefore you're really locked into this question of who is in the federal government, what political party is leading the country. So this question of why does a subnational government lead or not? I'm drawing here a little bit from also states within global regimes. But the first, if a country feels threatened by a collective action environmental problem, then it is motivated to take a lead role. And the prime example of this is Sweden in the 1960s, became aware of acidification of its lakes coming from Western Germany and the UK and others, and led the push. That's what led to the Stockholm Conference. Sweden was motivated. The reverse of that, a country which has a high economic cost from the solution tends to play a veto role, and the example of that would be Saudi Arabia, whose economy is so dependent upon fossil fuels, has consistently played a veto role at the international level. Alberta within Canada has played a veto role within Canadian federal provincial. The flip side of that, if you have a country which has a low economic cost in terms of action, it is more likely to play a lead role. And the best example of this is Germany in 1997, when the EU was negotiating its first burden-sharing agreement. Germany had reunified. It was busy spending huge amounts of money to modernize the East German plant for reasons which had nothing to do with climate change. And my understanding is that the German national government felt we can be contributing to overall EU reductions at a very, very low cost because we're spending most of that money anyway. And Germany took on something like 80% of the total EU reduction, and therefore easing the burden on everybody else and allowing countries like Portugal and Greece to have actual emission increases agreed upon, and it was because of this low cost. And then the next factor is internal politics, the strength of the environmental movement relative to business, the ideology of the governing party, although I would argue, generally speaking, ideology of the governing party is not that significant, but still, these can lead subnational jurisdiction to either lead or veto. And then the final one, if a subnational government, because of some of these factors, is moving toward acting itself, it may well want to ensure competitiveness for concerns that it will get too far ahead of its the neighboring jurisdictions with which it trades. It may want to try and bring others along. And my understanding is that that is one of the major motivators for California playing a lead role in the Western Climate Initiative. So, if we have, and I'm going to return to this when we come to this question of where Ontario might fit in this, but before this, just very quickly, my argument of why, in a formal sense, above and beyond things like policy diffusion, allocation is necessary, that we may want to get all we can. I take Matt's argument, we may want to get all we can from the bottom up, but you also need a certain amount of top down. And it comes from the fact that we're dealing with a global collective action problem, and that means that countries have to cooperate in some way. To do that, they have to give some kind of commitment to what share each is going to take in this formal system. For a federation like Canada, as soon as you take on one number, you immediately have this question of how do you then divide that number up internally? So the EU in 1997 was getting ready to go into Kyoto, and it was willing to commit to an 8% reduction. And within the EU, the question right away came up, I think because it's a collection of member states, of sovereign states, how do we divide that up amongst the states? Who's going to reduce by how much? Canada took on a commitment of a 6% reduction. Inherently, that exact same question was faced by Canadian policymakers, but Canadian governments, federal and provincial, refused to address the question, except for Quebec. Quebec was the one province that wanted to have an explicit agreement. Quebec was led by a separatist government that was saying, if we were a country, we'd be meeting the Kyoto goals and we wouldn't have to be worrying about all you people. So Quebec was willing, nobody else was. And that's the big difference between Canada and the EU. The EU started from the assumption it has to divide up. Canada was ignoring that. Now, what happens then is that when you're looking at this overall reduction, if all the sources were geographically evenly spread throughout the country, all the parts of the country could be reducing by the same amount, you wouldn't have a problem. But when you have geographically concentrated sources, as you do in Canada with the oil industry or in the EU with the coal industry in Poland and so on, then you have differing costs. And because you're a federated system, you have a subnational government with constitutional powers to defend those concentrated economic interests, and you run into a problem. The only way you can address that problem is to bargain, to try and reach some kind of an agreement on allocation with perhaps differing targets the way the EU did, or with financial compensation, but you can't bargain unless you explicitly recognize the need to do this. So now, changing gears, going to look at Ontario. I'm going to go back further in history than Francis did. He only went back to the OPEC oil crisis. I'm going to go back to Confederation, 1867. And for the benefit of our European friends, the reason that Canada came into existence is because Upper and Lower Canada, what are now Ontario and Quebec, were in an institutional framework that locked them into deadlock. They couldn't get anywhere. They said, let's solve this by going out into the colonies and drawing in these other parts of the country, and we'll be top dog, everything's going to be fine, and the Maritimes and the West will come in. And that's the way the country ran for a long time. You had Ontario and Quebec basically running things, the industrial heartland selling to the other parts of the country on either side behind a high U.S. tariff. And what that meant is that Ontario's interests were seen as identical with the Canadian interest. Quebec in the 1960s then started to move off into its own separate interest with the Quiet Revolution, but Ontario remained absolutely identical with the Canadian interest. I grew up in Ontario, just outside Toronto, and I never thought there was any difference between Ontario and Canada. I thought they were all the same. And I went off to university, and we all decided that we would watch a Grey Cup game together. And again, for the benefit of my European friends, the Grey Cup is the one game in which it actually is Canadian, and somebody from the East plays somebody from the West. So here all these U of T students got together, we were going to drink some beer and watch the Grey Cup game, and one of them arrived. I'd known this young man for quite some time, but he was wearing a white Stetson. And it suddenly, he's from the West. And I had this point of illumination about, my goodness, the whole country isn't just Ontario. So that's the way Ontario thought. Ontario supported Trudeau and repatriation. It was in the 1990s, and the theory is that with an increase in north-south trade, that an Ontario government started to articulate a distinct Ontario interest, and to say that this is separate from the national interest. And where we sit now, we have come back to very much an Ontario-Quebec alliance for economic reasons, but also for environmental. So for Ontario and efforts to develop formal, coordinated national climate change policy, federal, provincial, I've just thrown in a quick reference to the predecessor, the 1985 Federal Provincial Acid Rain Program. In this situation, acid rain was a Canada-U.S. bilateral problem. The Canadian federal government at the time was interested in acting on the issue, and it was locked in a two-level dynamic of negotiating with the U.S. and negotiating at the same time with the provinces. Ontario, one of the major sources, willing to cooperate, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the Ontario program was the result of domestic Ontario politics and a change in government in 1985. The period of trying to develop climate policy, coordinated climate policies from 1990 to 2002, this is the one I studied for the project I was mentioning. One of my interviewees then gave me this picture of the way the rest of the country viewed Ontario, that there were all these differences between Quebec and Alberta and so on, but they were all sort of moving down the same path. But Ontario was always on the side. It was never fully committed. And this was at a time of a right-wing conservative government in Ontario, which didn't really believe in the issue. And then in the year 2000, Kathy talked about different vetoes. There was a process to develop within that federal provincial negotiating process, an actual framework agreement that would commit everybody, lock themselves in more to the process. And everybody thought that an agreement had been negotiated, agreed upon. They were in Quebec City for a federal provincial meeting, and the Ontario officials thought it had been agreed upon. And that morning, some new Ontario people appeared, and they said Ontario's pulling out. And nobody ever, and I still myself do not quite know why, but this is the kind of role that Ontario was playing. Ontario phased out coal, but this was the product of domestic Ontario politics, mostly driven by health concerns, not really as a climate issue. Ontario in 2009 acted on policy, and you might argue this was on climate, and you might argue this was policy diffusion. The Ontario minister of the day went off to Germany, saw the feed-in tariff program, came back and did it, but it was not Ontario contributing to part of a national program. There was no national effort by then. And then more recently, we have the Canadian Environmental Strategy developed by the provinces alone without any role by the federal government, led largely by Alberta, which is trying to get pipeline approvals, Ontario not playing a lead role. So I would sum this up by saying that in a formal sense, Ontario so far has not played a lead national role. So to go back to my question, I've only got 2 more slides and then I'm going to stop. Is it likely that Ontario would play a lead role? And you go back to the picture I was giving of the factors that would lead to it, it's hard to get. Ontario is not in the position of Sweden, downwind from acid rain. It might not be, it's not like Alberta, which is pretty well locked into a veto role by its high cost of action. So perhaps there's a greater likelihood there. Internal politics might lead Ontario as long as you have a Liberal or NDP government, but there's always the possibility of going back to a Conservative government, which would remove that. If Ontario wants to bring along other subnational governments, it's going to, because it's acting and getting further ahead and worried about the trade implications, it's going to be looking to U.S. states as trading partners as much as other Canadian provinces. Other Canadian provinces don't really matter all that much to Ontario. And then what I said at the beginning, Ontario lacks the ability, even if it wanted to play a leadership role, it lacks the ability to influence other provinces. I would argue there's a very low likelihood of Ontario playing a leadership role. Here's my prescription for the way things might go forward, that we've got the kind of lead action that's been talked about here with the BC carbon tax in Quebec. In terms of this formal coordination, the closest lead point to answer the original question that I was charged with, came from the federal Liberal government, which at least was trying to cobble together a national program, but was then replaced in 2006 by the current Canadian government, federal government, which has no interest at all, and to some extent Quebec, but Quebec is very hampered by, it's got very much its own agenda. And then we have this so there's not much in the way of leadership points, very high veto point for completely understandable economic reasons. So that takes me back to the federal government. Provinces cannot influence one another. The federal government can influence provinces by, number one, threatening to regulate, and that will induce action to keep the federal government out of their backyard. They will regulate themselves. And number two, the federal government has money, and that is the way Canadian federalism basically works, is through the incentive of federal money. So my argument is that to find a leadership point in the Canadian system, it has to come from Ottawa. It's not going to come from the provinces. And once we've got that in place, which we might have after October 19th, without being the least bit partisan, I might just say, yes, we might. But the first step then, I would argue, is to sit down and address this problem of differing costs and benefits. Thank you all very much.